Welcome to the 48th reading of my memoir, The Innocence of Guilt. More love, confusion. Taking one of my lonesome walks to the park one afternoon, who should I bump into but Patrick? We stopped to talk and he asked me if I was seeing anyone. Once he knew that Ben and I weren't together anymore, he asked me for a date, and I agreed. It wasn't that I'd stopped loving him, I told myself. I'd had to choose between him and Ben, because I couldn't have two boyfriends. That was all. He asked me if I still cared for Ben, and I lied, so much for my high Christian standards. He wasn't too convinced, so I said I would prove it to him. The proof wasn't what he hoped for, but he reluctantly agreed to humour me. We went to Hilly Fields, a favourite stomping ground, one afternoon, and I piled all Ben's letters to me on the grass and persuaded him to put a match to them. As the funeral pyre of Ben's devotion and subsequent betrayal burned furiously, I pledged my undying love to Patrick and sealed it with a kiss. As the old familiar feelings he always managed to awaken in me welled up, I fought to convince myself I could forget Ben. My brief romance with him had revealed a different world than the one Patrick inhabited. With Patrick, I wouldn't be able to discuss poetry, classical music, or books. Nothing intellectual. A stroll around the local streets, a wait outside the pub, while he enjoyed a beer or two because I stubbornly refused to go inside. A once-in-a-while treat to the pictures, and then the usual kissing session. Patrick, too, had doubts about me he readily shared. As we cuddled together in a doorway, shortly after we got back together, he admitted shock at me leaving him for another boy. He had planned to get engaged to me. The ring had been picked out with the help of his mother. I laughed. "You mean you got your mother to pick a ring? You didn't tell me anything about it. How come your mother was in on it and not me?" I asked if I would still get the ring. That set him off in another burst of indignation. "I don't know if I can trust you again," he replied. Guilt descended. Still, I thought back to my infatuation with him and realized he'd brought it on himself. If he'd spent more time with me, I wouldn't have been so lonely. If I hadn't been lonely, I wouldn't have trudged off to the tramp supper. There would have been no Ben in my life. I told him about my conversion, not the part about the white light, as I knew he wouldn't believe it. I didn't think anyone would believe that. He wasn't particularly interested, although he didn't ridicule me. He simply said he didn't understand where my crazy ideas came from, why I had to keep changing things in my life, why I had to keep questioning things. I asked him if he'd care to read my diary in order to understand me better. I suppose I pushed it onto him as he wasn't into reading books. He took it and returned it a week later, claiming he'd read it. He seemed more somber, and I grew to regret letting him into my private thoughts. When I thought of what he'd read, my lack of self-esteem, my depression, the intensity of my need and dependence on him, the suicidal thoughts and horror of horrors, the attempt itself, I suspected I'd crossed over a forbidden line, taking him to places he didn't deserve to know existed. Instead of drawing him closer, the intimate details of me seemed to push him farther away. Never one for many words, he maintained a silence on the contents of my diary, which unsettled me. Has he showed it to his mother or to his friends? I didn't dare ask. Out of character for him, we hardly went anywhere but to the pictures. He booked a table at a Chinese restaurant recently opened up in town. Off we went, all dressed up in our best. I hadn't been to a formal restaurant before and was completely bowled over by the atmosphere. White linen cloths on the tables, waiters with white napkins over their arms, ready to serve us like royalty. When the meal arrived, nausea overcame me, and not one morsel of food passed my lips. A terrible time. Patrick embarrassed and angry, and the waiters repeatedly asking if the food wasn't to my liking. I didn't know why I reacted that way. As we walked home in silence, I wanted to dig a huge hole in the ground, jump in and tell him to chuck the earth in and bury me. Curiously enough, he didn't leave me over it. We appeared to be addicted to each other for all the wrong reasons. One night he brought up the question never far from his thoughts. Like a long playing record came the familiar reply from me. I'm saving myself for the person I'm going to marry. Maybe that person will turn out to be me, he said, gazing at me seriously. But he didn't understand. It wouldn't have made any difference if he'd put a ring on my finger that very night. Nothing but marriage would get him what he wanted. And despite what he said, it didn't appear to be anywhere on the horizon. He still hadn't told me he loved me, so I refused to give in. Another complication. I still loved Ben. It tore me apart to see him flirting with other girls at youth group. My spiritual conversion hadn't helped me too much either. Not a lot of change in my basic behavior. Some subtle improvements. The poem I wrote for a girl at the factory whose boyfriend dumped her. The day I helped my next-door neighbour carry a heavy shopping bag down the hill to his front door. The time I decided not to help myself to the biggest biscuit on the plate. Nothing that would win me gold medals in goodness. I still argued with my father and pushed his buttons, setting off the machinery of his rage. During one of our altercations, he raised his hand to hit me, and Mum's scissors sat on the table beside her sewing basket within my reach. I grabbed them and threatened him with them, holding the points to his chest. If you touch me, I'll put these right through you, I warned, and he backed away for the first time ever in my life. A brief truce in our interminable war. Then, without any warning, Patrick lost interest in me again. His mother must have been putting pressure on him, and unlike me, he listened to his mother and valued her opinions. Neither of our mothers wanted us to stay together. Each expressed their own reasons from time to time. Character assassinations. Instead of falling apart, I settled into a dull ache, interspersed with bright moments during youth group when I succeeded in convincing all present that I was the life and soul of the party. A brilliant act. In one of my prayer times, I asked God, whose tortured son's effigy still hung on a cross on the wall of my room, why he hadn't let me gas myself in the scullery, but saved me instead for what seemed to be nothing but trouble and heartache. The same voice I heard that day spoke these words in my left ear. Because I gave you life, and only I have the right to take it away. I was God's property, and he wanted to keep me alive. For what reason? I had no idea. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to subscribe, like, or comment on this reading, and hopefully you will tune in to the next one. Bye for now.